In the name of God, our Maker, Redeemer, and Sanctifier.
Amen.
Well, good morning.
Good morning. Good
morning.
Happy 4th of July weekend to you all. A Bible study that took place in Litchfield, Connecticut this last week looked at these readings, and I had a report from one of its members, my mother, about how they responded to the reading. And so that sent me looking into Wikipedia to find out about Miss Manners, because I didn't know who Miss Manners was. How many of you know Miss Manners? So she's a 73-year-old Washington woman who writes a column. I guess you all know that, but I was just naive. And she writes a column about etiquette. And she's rather bold in what she writes. And one of the things that she's quoted as saying is that whether or not you believe in etiquette, it's always a play. And that if you're not paying attention, what you do in relationship with other people can cut off a relationship. That if you aren't sensitive to the rules of etiquette, you really are creating roadblocks in terms of building relationships with other people. And that was an interesting sort of take on the sweep of the readings that they would get into talking about etiquette, because of course the Naaman's sort of journey to Israel had to do with observing certain rules of conversation and what he was being welcomed by Elijah. And then the 70 that were sent out 2 by 2 were being welcomed into people's homes. So there's a certain etiquette or rules that might be at play in terms of what's socially acceptable as you go along. And particularly with Naaman, I was interested to sort of think through the steps of Naaman's journey, because if you think about it, it's really quite particular that Naaman ended up going to the prophet in Israel. His journey, of course, began because he was affected with leprosy, and this was quite a shame to him. In spite of all of his very notable virile activity, he felt somehow much less than what he should be because he had this disfiguring ailment. And nothing in his own land could cure it. So he was sensitive to the advice of a captive Israelite who was a slave in his home. So how generous this slave was to say, oh, if you go to Israel, this can be cured. And so he goes to the king, right, of his Lord, and gets letters of introduction that make the king of Israel panic-stricken, because it sounds like the one king's picking a fight with the other. If you don't cure Naaman, I'm going to be at war with you, is how the king of Israel responds. And he says, what am I going to do? I don't have anything to do with curing leprosy. But Elijah speaks up and says, send him to me. Now, what would a good host do when a general shows up at his door? Would a good host go out and greet the general? Wouldn't that be etiquette? But no, he doesn't. He sends a slave out with a message to Naaman and says, go wash in the river 7 times, wash in the Jordan, and you'll be healed. And Naaman is indignant because he has an idea of what is supposed to happen. The great man is supposed to come out and greet him and wave his arm over the spot, and it would be, and say some magic words, invoke his God, and it would be healed. And so Naaman's about to storm off in a rage. And it was the counsel again of his servants that stopped him. And they say, Father, if it was something complicated, if it was something difficult, wouldn't you do it? Why not do the simple thing and follow the instruction? And so Naaman does. And he, of course, is made clean, his skin like that of a young boy. And it's for next week. You'll find out how he responds to all that. But But his etiquette could have broken the relationship, right? I mean, he was ready to know how things were supposed to go. He had it all mapped out in his head. You know, if this is going to work, it's going to work this way. This is how it's going to work. And happily for Naaman, he had the counsel of a slave girl in his home and the counsel of those that assisted him in his journey, so that his arrogance, his prejudice was confronted, and he was able to do the simple thing, and in doing that to find healing. And so he ended up with a very constructive relationship with Elijah, in fact, in spite of the fact that he didn't read Miss Manners before he went on his journey. And then what about Miss Manners in the 70s, going out 2 by 2? Well, there's some instructions from Jesus in terms of how they're to make home as they go away, as they go around. And they're to go to a house and say, "Peace be to this house." And if the peace rests there, then they know that's a good place for them to be. And so there's something about a welcome. There's something about a meeting that has the element of peace. And that had me thinking, well, how would you know that your peace rests with that house? Have you ever had that as you've met somebody? A sense of welcome that seemed like an openness and a freedom and something peaceful, a uniting with a stranger? I've had that, and it is remarkable when it happens for me. And it says something to me about the space that I happen to be in at that moment, but it's also with what's going on with the other person, because it can be in the context of a different sort of transaction, and yet we both know, or at least it seems to me, that we both know that we're meeting in something more than the transaction. Sounds like the instructions I offered for the song. It's like, I think you know what I mean. If you've experienced it, you know. I mean, I had it at Dave's Market a couple of weeks ago, where I was just with the cashier in the transaction, and yet there was a meeting in the transaction that had more to do with just being with each other than the business that we were conducting. Do you know what I mean? It was like there was a person who was showing up, and I was a person showing up, and we were sort of with each other in this affectionate, loving way. There was a meeting of love. And there was service in that was much more than the transaction. There was this participation in each other's lives, even for the flash of a moment. But it was real. I could just sense it. It wasn't we were getting something done, but we were with each other, even for a moment. And I think that helps me to untangle what Jesus means when he says, if your peace comes to that house, you know, and you can sense it coming back, it's not something of etiquette would be good in approaching the house, of course, to have the proper way of introducing yourself. But then there's this meeting that's much more than the rules. It's much more than what's accomplished. It's something about being with that is well beyond what gets accomplished or through a transaction. Do you know, there's something about, in both of these stories, with Naaman and with the 70, and I think that's what Jesus is saying at the end about, well, rejoice that your name is written in heaven. There's something about recognizing that your name, your nature, is a heavenly one, and that there's something beyond transaction, beyond the flesh, beyond the physical realm, that is engaged about who you are and about who the other is. And that there's a meeting at that level which can allow a transaction to go through, to happen, but there's something else happening at the same time. There's the recognition. Oh my gosh. And it isn't like It can be very simple. It's like there's washing going on here. There's healing. There's some meeting of two people that is beyond a transaction. And there can be washing and healing and restoration. And unhappily for all of us, I think, I know for myself, I can get so caught up in what needs to be done, what I'm trying to accomplish, what someone's trying to accomplish for me, or whatever's going on, that the meeting of the people, the meeting with the other, is lost to my awareness so often. And sometimes it's because the other person is caught up in whatever they're doing. And they're just thinking about the next thing that needs to be done. And so it's hard to just be with the other and to recognize the peace that comes from being with another human being truly alive. Paul, I think, is referring to this in his letter to the Galatians when he talks about how important it is that we truly serve one another. Now, the serving one another can get into us thinking about how we do it. I think the serving of one another has more to do with how we are with each other, that we are to be in a loving attitude to one another, in an attitude of loving service. Not so much caught up in what we need to do, but what we need to be. That we need to be heartfully present with each other and open to the other's presence with us. And that then peace transpires whatever the transaction. And it isn't that we can command this or require it, that we'd be like Naaman. We've got to figure out how it's supposed to be. But it's something about an openness to being present to what God is doing in the moment. To be sensitive to what is arising in the moment that may be love or peace or gentleness or kindness. And being sensitive to that when it emerges in the relationship, that quality, and not be so caught up in what we're trying to do that we miss it. I think the disciples sort of got caught up in all the stuff that they were able to do and said, oh, this is so great. Look at what we can do. And Jesus said, oh, calm down. There's something about just being the people whose names are in heaven. You know, to know that your nature comes from heaven, not from the earth. That you know that wonderful saying, that we're in the world, but we're not of it. You know, to be in the world does mean to be doing transactions of one sort or another. And the story of Naaman, the story of the 70s, is full of transactions happening. But there's something about what else is going on in the midst of it, which is the truth of what's actually occurring. And that has to do with the life and the love that's present in the relationship. So it serves for me as a caution against being so caught up in what we need to do, that we lose sight of who's actually in front of us. So just feel into that as you go along the coming weeks and days and weeks, and wonder, am I able to offer my peace here, and would I be present enough to recognize if it's being received and returned? Because that can open up this window that's so precious of knowing that you and another have truly met.